Hi, I'm Sean. I am a member at Redemption Church, and I am recording this message as a plea to all those who are members and attend Redemption churches. I'm recording this message because, as a long-term member of the church, since it was East Valley Bible Church, I have respected the church's leaders and theological authorities. However, even though my wife and I had recently begun to volunteer at the church, fully intending to resume worship and services for the indefinite future under Tyler's leadership, I believe it is quite clear that Tyler has been misleading his congregation and that he is doing so according to racist values. I want to play aspects of an interview he recently did with a pastor. I want to ask you, if you are willing to consider listening to, watching this video, to ask yourself, is this message that he gives to this pastor the message he has been preaching to you? Did you know that this interview existed? Did you know that this agenda existed? Or is it possible that he is maligning you to other people while secretly holding on to an agenda that he cannot reveal to you now, but will slowly inject into his sermons and into church leadership over time until it is too late to make changes? First off, Karen Stewart begins an interview with him by playing his video to us from a couple of weeks ago, perhaps 3 weeks ago now. And I just want to call out the beginning of this, which sets the tone for his approach to us as a congregation.
Church, and it's a conviction based upon the heart of God, that we wouldn't hide behind facts or all the time needing to figure it out and falling prey to becoming more like the priest and the Levite of the parable of the Good Samaritan, rather than...
Okay, so Tyler begins by pointing out that sin is not created by circumstances but is revealed, and that we need to stop being indifferent to the suffering of others. He goes on to say that we must not hide behind facts or needing to figure it out. Now, he says this glibly, he says this in passing, but I'm asking you to reflect, and becomes a pattern. I'm asking you to reflect on the substance of that statement. And let us recall that the Good Samaritan was the person that was in our proximity, the person that the Good Samaritan simply was nearby in his life.
God is laying in the streets. The image of God is laying in the streets. We don't have the option at this moment to say, wait for the facts. If you think from the heart of God, which is expressed to us in the Bible as the heart of a father, when his child is laying dead in the streets, doesn't say, wait for the facts.
Okay, so again, what is the basis for saying that a person who has been killed is a tragedy that cannot wait for the facts to make judgment? It is a tragedy every time somebody is murdered, killed, every time there is injustice in the world. It is a tragedy. But society dictates that we determine the circumstances around that tragedy. There are quite a few people of all different races who die, and they go to court and they have to adjudicate the cause of that death, whether it was involuntary manslaughter, whether it was intentional murder, whether it was any number of circumstances. And we, as a society, have resolved to work through that system of justice because the circumstances matter. But Tyler is saying that in this case of Ahmaud Arbery, We're not permitted to know the facts before we make our judgment. Why? Literally because of this man's skin color. I should say that I want to play this entire video, but it is over an hour long, and to review it would make it over 2-3 hours long. So I can't, as a practical matter, do that. I beg you to watch this video. It is listed on YouTube as From Surviving to Thriving, Episode 11. Please watch the entire thing. But I need to bring to your attention those critical parts of this video that demonstrate racism.
Speaks about us as a body, and this is true of the body of Christ beyond Redemption Church. And he says, when one part of the body is grieving, the whole body grieves. More accurately, when one part is in pain, the whole body is in pain.
Okay, so he describes the fact that one part of the body, obviously meaning a certain part of a congregation, in pain means the entire body of Christ is in pain, which is fine. However, he goes on to describe that indifference on one part or less concern on one part is sinful, and therefore we are sinning by our indifference to the suffering of black people. I ask you to consider that as a simple reality. Because his congregation is white, he presumes indifference on the part of that congregation, and he presumes outsized suffering on the part of those who are not white. This is racism, because if you've ever had a neighbor, a friend, who has suffered, for example, the loss of a child, you know that it is not possible to experience the exact suffering that that person suffered when they experienced that situation. But we grieve with them to the degree that we are able. And when these racial tensions flared up, speaking for myself, I know that I was deeply grieved. I was upset by the circumstance. I was upset by what had happened to a human being's life. And I was upset that it would flare up additional tension between human beings on planet Earth. But he can declare what is an appropriate level of additional suffering on the part of people based on what? Based on only their skin color.
The equivalent would be, I don't care if you tear your social media accounts. I don't care if you put a like on a button. Tear your hearts. God, cut us open by your powerful voice and your powerful word that's stronger than any two-edged sword. Don't hide behind our theologies that we say, oh, well, we've got to ask these questions, and fall guilty of being a priest or a Levite who felt like they...
Okay, so don't fall behind these theologies that say we've got to ask these questions. Again and again, he insists that we don't have the right to evaluate the circumstances of a person's death because of his skin color. I have never heard a pastor in my entire life say that when a person of a different skin color has died, we're not permitted to evaluate the circumstances around that death, but must presume that a person of a different color is responsible through commission or omission or whatever, as he goes on later to say. And I'm going to ask you to consider a few things in the course of this, because it is only by virtue of demanding that you not look at facts, that you not look at reason, that he is giving himself permission to judge an entire group of people based on the color of their skin, both positive and to the negative. So Ahmaud Arbery died tragically at the hands of two men, white, who said they believed that he was in progress of robbing a house. Why is it that coverage of Ahmaud Arbery's specific situation virtually vanished after these two men were arrested and brought up on charges. Because the most evidence you have supporting pure racism on the part of these men is a video. Any further inquiry into the situation at all demonstrates that these men were attempting to protect a house, had at least reasonable cause to believe that this may have been a burglary, and were reacting in the moment and thought they could make a citizen's arrest. Was it appropriate? Was it appropriate that they brought guns? Was it appropriate that they even went after this person instead of just letting the police track him down? I would argue, I would never do it myself. But the question is, was this an act of sheer racism? It can only be treated that way so long as we do not look at the facts any further than a video with no context. And for further context, I will point out Black Lives Matter, which Tyler, in its organizational form, explicitly rejected. Black Lives Matter was formed on the basis of the killing of Trayvon Martin. Trayvon Martin was said to be a nice boy who never hurt anybody and died tragically as a result of racism at the hands of, for the first time ever, what was deemed a white Latino. Now, again, as soon as the news media covered this, it was racism. Everybody knew it was racism. Why? Because there was no evaluation of the situation permitted. As soon as there was any investigation done, it was demonstrated that that line was fraudulent. Trayvon Martin was beating this man's head on the sidewalk. He went to the hospital with serious head wounds and was defending his life. That is why he was not convicted of a crime, because he was acting inarguably in defense of his life, having his head bashed in by this teenager. Another situation that you are not allowed to evaluate was the death of Michael Brown, who was crossing the street toward a police officer in his car and was supposedly gunned down in cold blood by that police officer while holding his hands up and saying, "Don't shoot." He went to trial, and I don't know how many people broadly know this to this day, because of how often we see chants of "hands up, don't shoot" in Chaz, for example, when it was temporarily existed in Seattle. Hands up, don't shoot was a lie from the beginning and is a lie today. But the only way that we know that is by looking at the circumstances and asking questions about what was inarguably a tragedy. Hands up, don't shoot was shown to be a lie by black people in a court situation where they were asked for testimony under oath. Eyewitnesses so completely, clearly demonstrated that hands up, don't shoot was a lie that police officer was not found guilty of any crime. And we know that he was in fact defending himself from a man who was trying to grab his gun. And obviously, in the context of this video, the fourth very prominent death was that of George Floyd. George Floyd died in a situation where a police officer had his knee on his neck. The only way that it can be evaluated as a racist killing is when we do not ask questions, look at the facts, or make inquiries into the reality of the situation. Tyler is 100% dependent on your ongoing ignorance so that you can judge people based on skin color as he wants. Because when you take any effort to look into the George Floyd situation, now we have seen additional video that shows that George Floyd was crying for that he can't breathe, was acting incredibly belligerently from the very beginning of the interaction, of the altercation. But more to the point, we know that George Floyd had 4 different drugs in his system, including a fatal dose of fentanyl. This was a tragedy, but it was not a tragedy of racism. It was a tragedy of circumstances that police could not have known were happening at that moment. Around the country, for ages and ages, police at various times have placed their knee on the neck of a person that they are attempting to arrest without those people dying with any regularity. George Floyd died objectively as a combination of circumstances that included his own actions and his drug use, and yes, the fact that he had COVID, which affects one's breathing. I don't want to blame George Floyd's death on George Floyd, but there is no objective way that it can be claimed that they knew they were killing this man and were doing so for racist reasons. All of that is simply to respond to the fact that Tyler demands obedience based only on skin color and that you reject circumstances and facts.
We're watching the discrepancy, and I'll use the term of grief within our body.
Okay.
And we had actually had a conversation pre the death of Ahmaud Arbery. Actually, it was quite tense on our leadership team regarding COVID, because there was all of this conversation in some of the congregations that were predominantly, not exclusively white, in which we were really talking about how essentially we need to all get along, Romans 14, as it comes to our approach to the COVID situation, what we thought of it, what we didn't think of it. And many of our leaders of color were really frustrated by the level of intensity in which these white evangelicals, I'll just use that shorthand, and we can get into that talk, were making such a big deal about everything from their businesses having to be closed, some of them, not all of them, but some of them about wearing masks, whether to or not to. And truthfully, they were just feeling like this is such a stupid, trite conversation while we're dealing with these major racial injustices. And so that we were on this call and you could see the tension and frustration in the room. And so.
Okay, so first off, once again, in passing, Tyler just simply gets to claim that he's going to use the term white evangelicals as shorthand. What is it shorthand for? White evangelicals. So people as a group that he can judge based on the color of their skin. It's not shorthand. It is how he judges an entire group of people. So, to carry on to what he was saying, he's making the argument that these leaders were debating COVID and how to approach it as a church, and that we should be unified because we are one body in Christ. But those that he claims were valid and were of a certain color said that that was ridiculous because of all the racial injustice. How can you argue about COVID with all the racial injustice going on? So I want to ask, does your business being shut down, your livelihood being destroyed, and your debate over whether we as a body of Christ should be silenced in a public and in personal manner because of a disease that fundamentally functions like the flu, which sounds awful to so many people who have not in fact looked at the numbers. The argument that we have a difference of approach in an issue that affects literally the entire globe and millions and millions and millions of people, in fact, virtually every person in the United States of America, that is not valid because of what they claim is constant and incredible racial injustice. We're not allowed to discuss a matter that affects hundreds of millions because of ongoing racial injustice. So let's flip that on its head. What if every time any congregation, any pastor wanted to discuss any issue about life, we challenged them asking, why are hundreds of people dying in the inner cities of Baltimore and in the inner cities of Chicago and in these other large cities? Why are blacks allowed to go on killing each other? Why do we not stop that? We would be called racists simply for bringing up the issue. We are called racists. Why? Because theoretically, cop killings are so incredibly horrifying and abusive, because supposedly attacks on black people are so incredibly rampant, as is said later in this video. But, again, that requires that we not have the permission to look at facts, to consider reality. So we have to consider reality. We have to ask ourselves, what is, in fact, the real injustice in this world against black people? Statistically, killings of black people by police officers amount to 0.1% of all African Americans killed. 0.1% of all African Americans who do get killed. A police officer is 18.5 times more likely to be killed by a black person than a black person who is unarmed is to be killed by a police officer who is supposedly murdering them wantonly. So it is, again, totally fair to say that cops are killing black people throughout the country without any recourse, without any justice, so long as you do not take one moment to consider reality. And based upon those injustices that they declare without any actual evidence, but simply due to the emotional surge caused by a publicized killing, they can ask for whatever they want, because it's all on other people based on their skin color.
Of doing some real community ministry that will help us address the whole thing with racism. But for African American viewers, and it still begs the question of what is different now? Is it a culmination, a snowball of things? Because we would say clearly black bodies have been dying, especially black male bodies have been dying so regularly at the hands of the police, and in general, healthcare disparities, school disparities. All of these disparities have been so prominent so long. Still, why now?
Yeah.
So what is different now? All of these black bodies have been dying at the hands of police and general things like healthcare, school disparities, etc. Have they really? In 2018, the latest year for which such data have been published, African Americans made up 53% of known homicide offenders. They commit about 60% of robberies and 45% of assaults, in spite of the fact that they are 13% of the population. Who is killing black people? It is not police officers. It is black people. We don't enjoy that fact. We don't like it. We mourn it. It is a tragedy in the body. that we want to heal, but healing begins with honesty about the problem. And we are informed by Tyler that we are not permitted to reflect on the facts, that we are not permitted to ask questions. We can only judge based on the color of the skin of the most publicized victim.
African American leaders, both females and males, the community, the African American and especially African American Christian community, but I think it's true wider too, thinks collectively and multi-generationally, communally and throughout the generations.
Yes.
Where whites, I'll use this word, have the privilege, but think individualistically and maybe within the last 10 years.
I appreciate that right there. That has.
This is racism. It's racism. To claim that whites think only according to the last 10 years, think only individualistically, that blacks think collectively, multi-generationally. What you are saying is that because of a person's skin color, that determines how they think, act, believe. That is in fact part of their nature in terms of their values system and culture. That's racism. White people can be bad people. So can blacks. White people can be good people. So can blacks. The issue is our position toward God and toward our neighbor, not the color of our skin. When people discuss the black culture, black injustices, etc., there are a couple of leaders who are trotted out on a regular basis. These individuals who come from only this line of thinking are represented as black, but anybody who disagrees with them is either completely ignored or is literally called an Uncle Tom. There are quite a few people who do not think this way, who are black. But Tyler is saying that you're not allowed to think of them differently. You have to think of them as being a certain way because of the color of their skin. And I'm going to challenge this claim because, and this is Tyler throwing away his faith. It is Tyler throwing away what he knows to be true in favor of the satisfaction of approval from the world. And it is this. The reason he doesn't believe whites think multi-generationally and collectively is because Christians who embrace the Bible go back thousands of years. They believe that they are children of Abraham. We are children of the promise. All of us. Every person who has Jesus in his heart is a child of Abraham, our common ancestor. All of us. We think down through thousands of years. That is our identity. When we think of justice, we think of the God who called Abraham. When we think of justice, we think of the man who saved, who was willing to sacrifice his son Isaac, but in fact did not have to because God gave the sacrifice himself. God the Father, our Father in heaven, the Father of one family. We think multi-generationally. We think through hundreds and thousands of generations. It is incredibly racist to say that white people, because of the color of their skin, think back only through 10 years and only think of themselves. When we go to church, we see each other as one family that has traversed ages. Also, I should call out how, again, casually, He uses these terms. I will say the term privilege. Well, that is his term. He's not saying the term because he's looking for something more difficult to describe. He believes he can ascribe to white people the term privilege in a political context of the day, which means undeserved favor that puts them in advantage of people of a different color. That is racism. I grew up the son of a Mexican who adopted me, and thank God he did. My sister, because we were adopted by a Mexican, had a jump start out of college, not because she was white, but because she claimed the legal Mexican heritage to which she was permitted to ascribe herself. So, on our birth certificates, we are children of a Mexican father. We have never encountered racism because of that, and my sister encountered privilege. But, more to the point, my brother, through my father's first marriage, is of Mexican and Japanese descent. He is very successful. He went through college, he works hard, he's very smart, and he is wildly successful. And he is not white. I, on the other hand, did not finish college. I had to work from the ground up because I did not put myself on that pedestal of a college degree and give myself that opportunity. And I wasn't treated as having a college degree, ever. I had to work each step of the ladder due to the fact that I had not earned respect ahead of time, and my skin color got me nowhere. I love my father. I respect him tremendously. My life as a practical matter was incredibly improved by my Mexican father. He gave us security. He gave us safety in a home to live in. He gave us wisdom. All of these claims that I somehow benefit from white privilege simply because Tyler can look at my skin are completely absurd. And in this society, in my particular family, we have benefited or suffered because of the choices of our lives and chance, but not the color of our skin. It is always due to a host of issues, none of which have in our lives been whether we happen to be a certain color, and the fact that my last name is a Mexican name. I have lived an ordinary life and continue to do so.
Missing pieces in white evangelical theology. And I'm using that just as a shorthand. I understand some people, certainly white people, may have troubles with that, but truly in that theology is that it is a theology that's built because of the benefit to the white community, a lot of wealth, a lot of money, and the ability to view yourself as an individual in the current moment in time, even.
So white theology is built around benefiting the white community with wealth, money, and the ability to view yourself as an individual. That's racism. Tyler Johnson is a racist. He believes that the theology that we have been raised to believe in, saving us from ourselves into one body, into one family, repenting of our sins, whatever they may be, and giving ourselves over to God, that's racist. He believes that that is based on our attempts to privilege ourselves because of our skin color. The fact that he thinks he can judge us on that basis because he sees the color of our skin is racism.
So we have a list of names and a list of hashtags, and then something else happens, and it's like, well, how come we didn't keep on? And there are people behind the scenes that do keep on, but even as a whole, because it just gets tiring.
Yes.
Very tired of having to to do the same fight.
She says, we get tired of fighting the same battle over and over and over again. Where is there any mention at any point, and I again beg you to watch this video in its entirety, where is the mention of the fact that right now people who make these claims that they are making about systemic racism, about racial injustice, are rioting in the streets, destroying property, and killing people? It is not brought up one time, but she says they grow tired. There is no consideration for a culture that fosters violence in order to get God's justice as they see it.
And it doesn't feel like people of color are pulling by themselves anymore. It feels like it's been a tug of war, and you know how you're dug in and you're just like, I'm tired of pulling, and somebody comes along and picks up the rope and says, let me help you. That's what I feel like has come alongside. And that, so now everybody has to hold both of us accountable.
Right. We
for
we
the
try
long
it
haul,
last.
because
Yes.
it's a marathon. It is not a sprint.
It's a marathon.
The dismantling of systemic racism, I don't even know where to begin.
Yeah.
There's so
And I'm certain in our future walk in this, there's going to be moments where right now it feels like a Kairos moment. You can feel the energy propelling.
She says, in the dismantling of systemic racism, I don't even know where to begin. So I ask you to reflect on what we have heard about systemic racism. We have been told that education is systemic racism, that IQ tests are systemic racism, that medical care is systemic racism, that there are food deserts, which represent systemic racism, that police officers are systemic racism, that the courts are systemic racism, that the prison system is systemic racism. This is what you get when you identify yourself not as a child of Christ, not as a child of the Lord Most High, but as a victim group. It does not end. Every people group could lay claim to victim status in their own minds in one way or another. Every single group. Christians, even when we are oppressed, even when Christians are facing explicit extinction in countries around the world, though it is injustice, and though that injustice is resisted, the ultimate escape from that for the Christian is that which we are taught by our biblical forefathers, which was that we are not children of this world, that we are not a victim because our God is our Father, because the God of the universe controls our destiny. The moment that we shift our focus intentionally towards seeing the ways in which we have been treated unjustly, the list grows and grows and grows, inevitably, for every group, every individual person even, because we all are prone to think of ourselves as victims. And this, what he calls white Christian theology, is a theology that says, I reject giving myself the excuse to be a victim. And they say, easy for you to say, because why? Because of the color of your skin. But they do not know your heart. And I am asking you, if you have watched this long, I am asking you to ask yourself, do you help people on the street and then discover yourself not helping people because of the color of their skin? Do you donate to charities, but then decide you won't donate to specific charities because of the color of the skin of the people involved or the people that those charities might help? Do you discover yourself fraternizing with certain people, trying to bring them the message of Christ. But if they're a certain skin color, you don't want to bring them the message of Christ? Do you discover yourself advocating moral behavior towards certain people in your life, but deciding that that message of morality is not for other people because of their skin color? Is that how you function? That's what Tyler believes you function according to. He believes you care about protecting people of your skin color and the money you have. Is that you? If that is you, you still should not attend Tyler's church, since he is a racist, as are you. And you should go to a church that is not racist, so that you can learn not to judge people based on the color of their skin. But I'm guessing that, as I was raised, most of us who are Christian accept that we should love those around us, just as the Good Samaritan story taught us. Whether that brings us into physical contact or social contact or whatever with people of our color or any other color is not in and of itself the point. If we are doing good to those around us, then if somebody who is of a different color is around us, we will love and help them. I was told by Tyler's church, I was told by Tyler, I was told by Tim, that the outreach that they do with the money that I give them helps people of other colors. I was told that repeatedly. But Tyler seems to be suggesting that we give to those organizations believing that we're helping white people. Tyler seems to be suggesting that if you knew your money was going to those who didn't have your skin tone, you wouldn't give that money.
Our own marathon, walking up hills with no shoes kind of stories.
Yep.
But it's going to, like a marathon, you get somewhere in the race and you want water and you want somebody to cheer you on, and all the cheering is going to have stopped.
Yep.
And the real ramifications will come when it starts to hit an economic level. It hasn't hit economics yet, but when it really...
The real ramifications will come when it hits us. And who does she mean? She means Christians who are white. The real ramifications will come when it hits them economically, in their pocketbook. So again, you are racist, and Tyler might approach these topics theoretically, but as soon as he begins to explain how it should hurt you financially, you're going to fight back. That's when you're going to fight back, when you realize they're attempting to take your money. And again, I just ask you, is that how you think of people who don't happen to look exactly like you? That as long as you can protect your stuff, you'll pretend to care for them. But then as soon as your stuff is threatened, you're going to lash out at those people that do not look identical to you.
The moment we find ourselves in, when many white evangelicals press back against some evangelicals now doing work towards racial justice, and they'll say things like, we shouldn't be getting involved in those things. Though the funny part is they've done all of this work now for decades when it comes to abortion, when it comes to voting against gay marriage. So it's like they know what community organizing is and the building of power under the notion of evangelical for those things. So I'll just raise this question that I raised with many people is, why is it that this issue is so resisted at some levels? And I want to be clear to your audience, not at all. I mean, there's incredible movement happening inside the evangelical church on this level. So that to me is the way I would rightfully, the way I understand.
So he claims that evangelicalism is defined ultimately as social activism. That's what distinguishes it from other Christian faiths. And he claims that, of course, on abortion, you'll fight. But on this issue, you just don't want to get involved. So I'm asking you again, do you believe in your heart of hearts that you want to ignore an issue facing a certain community of people because you don't care about them? Or is it possible that you don't want this issue because what they're supporting is racism? What they're supporting is judging the death of one person as more important because of his skin color or less important because of his skin color, and judging it as a racist act because of his skin color, or judging it as not racist because of skin color. These are the only filters through which he now views Christian belief. He does not accept the possibility that we as Christians want people to behave morally. He doesn't consider that. It's not an option in his mind that we want people in the inner city to behave morally, to not kill each other, to not literally kill people for basketball shoes, for example. We don't want that in white communities any more than we want it in black communities. We want people who behave morally. We do not want them to excuse themselves because of the color of their skin, whether they be white or black. He doesn't consider that. He believes that the only reason you do not embrace the concept of systemic racial injustice is because you don't care about black people.
Talking about race. Well, to me, and this gets into the white evangelical term, is what they're not recognizing is, yes, affirm we're one human race. Let's say it's in multiple ethnicities, but we live in a context, in a culture that is elevated race to such a level that certain people have been oppressed and not had the same chances at equity that others ultimately have. And so you have to talk about these things historically, ultimately. And this is where the problem with evangelical, I think, comes in people. I'll just say it really quickly because I'm talking a lot. Christians unbiblically viewing power, what they've been given. So even when you talk about privilege, I'll say the Apostle Paul speaks about this when he says, what do you have that you didn't receive? And if you did receive it, why do you boast as though you didn't receive it? That's the problem with many shorthand white evangelicals, is that they have been at one point by God given much. When you're given anything, if we even went back hundreds of years in the history of our country, you would say, I've been given much to steward it well. Right. Well, that isn't what happened in so many of these traditions. They built more situations that would ultimately serve them and their families and their communities of what happened. And people...
So again, he is claiming, and he says earlier, that white Christians love to talk about one Christian human race. So he accuses us of loving to talk about how there's only one race. And why? Because of the color of our skin. That's the only reason he can come up with. Mind you, I'm asking, how are you in your heart? Why do you value the concept of one race? Is it because it tears down boundaries, or because it allows you to divide yourself from others? He goes on to say that whites should have shared the wealth that they got through white privilege, but instead they used it to protect themselves. Now, I'll admit that I think every group of people that becomes wealthy and powerful protects themselves. That's how Hollywood functions. That's how journalism functions. That's how politicians function. It's how every group of people functions. It's got nothing to do with skin color. Is it a sin? It certainly can be. When people store up their treasures on earth, then yes, they're acting in sin. But it is not a racial sin. It is a sin that is practiced by whites, by blacks, by Mexicans, by Asians, by everybody. For him to call out whites as using wealth to shield themselves, while saying that if in effect that's affecting oppression on black people, it's racist, because it is a sin that runs through every group of people ever known to exist. And again, pay attention to the fact that all of this comes down to money for them. When I say them, I mean Tyler as well as this pastor who is interviewing him. That's all they care about, is who has money. That's their concern.
We're left by, which is the part where you go, I don't see, I mean, this is the Frederick Douglass, there is a Christianity of Christ and a Christianity of the land. Of the Christianity of this land, I reject wholly, but I affirm the Christianity of Christ. So I think that what Douglass was identifying then is prevalent today. The same idea is that what people hate in white evangelicalism when they use the terminology is a Christianity of the land, not a Christianity of Christ. I could have said that shorter a long time ago.
No, I appreciate all of the explanation, because I think this is to be a very educational conversation, and I appreciate that. I think this is what lends itself to when you say that you say we, and so I use the term broadly to mean we as the Christian race, and more so white Christian race has been complicit, because it's all kumbaya until the rubber meets the road, and it's like, oh, wait, no. Because, and it goes kind of back to what you said earlier, that they think very individualistically. This is about me and mine, as opposed to this multi-generational challenge that has happened amongst people. Is that a summation? That's good.
Yeah.
So again, it's all kumbaya until the rubber meets the road, i.e. money. When whites, what are they going to, now they're racists, basically. They're apparently not racist with their mouth, perhaps, but suddenly they become racists as soon as the rubber meets the road. Further, what does she talk about when they're so thoroughly on the same page with each other?
And that to me is just something, again, I want to say this, I think the collective conscience inside the Black community, which I think is true in the Hispanic community, certainly true in the Indigenous community, is...
So the collective conscience of the Black community, the Indigenous community, the Hispanic community, okay? Whites are bad because of the color of their skin. They think individualistically. They only think within 10 years. He, a Christian leader, cannot conceive of the fact that you identify with Christ.
Is not nearly as prevalent in the minds of many of what would be called white evangelicals. And it's substantially problematic. So how does for those of you who are recognizing being complicit or the denomination, I don't even know how to word it. Sure.
I feel like speaking generally about an entire group of people might be unfair, but
Truly.
That's kind of where we are. We're kind of stuck. But how do you undo that when you recognize that you're complicit? Then what? And I know there's no simple, easy fix, but is it reparations? Is it, what's the next step?
Early on in the video, Tyler explains that they've been thinking for years about this. She, we know, has been thinking for years about this. They have worked together, debating about this. The only solution she can verbalize is reparations. That is the only thing she verbalizes in the entirety of this hour-long video, is reparations, which is literally simply a money exchange from one group of people based on their skin to another group of people based on their skin. That is racism. And it is the only thing they ever manage to specifically suggest in the entirety of the video.
Locking arms and going at it. And then it really lays out of what ultimately should happen. And this is where this gets real dicey, but it gets into even the economics in which you spoke about these things. So
Here's where it
churches
gets
like
into the
ours that
economics,
have,
once again,
so I'll
it's
use
about
Redemption
money.
as an example. Redemption Church gets built. My father-in-law,
I need to go back. Again, where is the discussion about not believing that crime is incidental? Where is the discussion about respect for authority? Where is the discussion about humility before your forefathers, before people who came before you who know and have given us wisdom? Where is the advocacy for marriage, for having children within the context of marriage? None of these things are advocated. The only thing that they seem to think is a solution is cash. And cash based on the color of your skin. Pay attention to what he says about his father-in-law.
so I'll use Redemption as an example. Redemption Church gets built. My father-in-law plants it. Well, he has a man that comes to him and says, hey, we're going to give you the land, what Redemption Gilbert is now on, for a penny.
Okay.
Well, all of a sudden you got to go, okay, how did this man develop an amazing business that he was able to give this for a penny? Now, I don't want to impose narrative upon something that may not be there.
I don't want to impose narrative on something that may not be there after imposing a narrative on something that most likely was not there. But even if it was, what in the world is he? He is accusing his father-in-law of being a beneficiary of white privilege in getting the land for the church. Tyler Johnson cannot find it in his soul to have another better explanation, such as, when you bless God, God blesses you. No, the answer is white privilege that his father was a beneficiary of.
Class, but I may not even be able to call it that.
Right.
Like understanding our content, because immediately if I called it,
Sorry.
he said, I will say this too, and the language that is being used now is a big conversation when we talk about making a point or making a difference. I mean, there's just such a resistance in many people to even begin to have this conversation. So when you're in a church, and again, like I said, in my environment and my role is these multi-congregations that are very different and are, because of that, are doing different things. So some of them you could enter in just immediately with, let's talk about race. Others of them you would have to do the Whiteness 101 class.
So that's beautiful. He says that you cannot speak a certain language to certain people based on their skin color. Earlier in the video, he talks about how there are congregations of blacks predominantly, congregations of undocumented immigrants predominantly, congregations of other victim groups predominantly. But a certain group, based on its skin color, cannot be spoken to honestly and directly. You'd have to start with a Whiteness 101 class, but you couldn't call it that. Last week, Tyler explained that he is beginning a private course that he's going to be teaching on following what he believes is the example of Jesus. And guess what? Out of that class, he is going to specially select leaders he deems fit to carry that on. Who do you think he is going to select out of that class? He is going to select those who agree with him that the predominant problem in the church is white people. And those people are going to be planted throughout the church to spread the gospel of racism. But he won't call it Whiteness 101. He won't call it racism. He'll call it something else, and he will deceive you until the church is fully indoctrinated as he sees fit to identify itself in groups of victims who need reparations. There's a lot more. I obviously cannot cover the entire video. I have gone on too long myself. But I am begging you, watch this video. As I say, it is From Surviving to Thriving, Episode 11. Watch the video in its entirety, pause, and think about what he is saying. Do the opposite of what he claims you're not permitted to do as a good Christian. You're not permitted to think about the facts. You're not permitted to ask questions. You're not permitted to evaluate it against your theology. You must simply accept what he tells you. Please, listen to these words from both of them and ask yourself, is he talking about you? Is your heart different toward your neighbor because of the color of their skin? Would you go out of your way to help somebody nearby you because of the color of their skin? If that is not you, if he is not aware of your secret sin, you need to stop giving to this church and you need to leave the church. And if it is you he's describing, you need to attend a church that is not focused on dividing people by race, that does not identify negative, destructive traits based on the color of a person's skin, and does not establish high morality and cultural value because of a different color of skin. You need to attend a church that recognizes that we all are one family, that we think in the thousands of years time frame because our Father was established on earth generationally, ages and ages and ages ago, through the grace of Christ. Do not let this man poison this church with racism, and then doing so by deceiving you from the pulpit in one church while telling what he believes to be the truth to others in other churches because they have the right color skin. I beg you, do not encourage this.